Job. Let's start with the exercise on slide 1. Read Job 1, 6 to 12. What insight is the reader given into the story of Job that Job's comforters and Job himself do not have? Please pause the video at this point so that you can answer the question. Read Job 1, 6 to 12. What insight is the reader given into the story of Job that Job's comforters and Job himself do not have? Well, the reader gets to see behind the scenes. We're given an insight into the spiritual realities that lie behind the physical realities. There's a discussion going on between God and Satan. God maintaining that Job is upright, verse 18. Satan maintaining that he only honours God because God has given him so many good things, verses 9 to 11. Take those good things away, says Satan, and Job will curse you. Satan then is allowed by God to take away what Job has, but not to harm him, verse 12. Now that's an important insight into our understanding of this story. The reader knows from the very beginning of the story that Job is an innocent sufferer and that he's being tested to show that his faith in God is real. Job himself doesn't know what's going on, and his comforters, as we'll see, believe that his suffering comes from the fact that he has personally sinned. Introduction. The title for the book, Job, is obviously taken from the main character. The 42 chapters of this book tell a simple but a heart-wrenching story. The story of the personal suffering of a man called Job. He's a devout believer and a wealthy man who loses everything: his health, his wealth, his family. And Job can't understand what's going on. He knows that God is good. He knows that God is sovereign and that God has caused this to happen to him. And so in this book, he tries to make sense of his personal tragedy. He tries to make sense of why God has allowed this to happen to him. The author of the book isn't identified. It's not even certain when or where the book was written. But it appears to describe the patriarchal period. That is the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, described in Genesis. Many writers believe that Job was probably a contemporary of Abraham. And Job is almost certainly a non-Israelite. He's a Gentile. The opening verse sets the story in the land of Uz. And although we don't know where that is anymore, it seems that it's not describing a place in Israel. Despite his Gentile background, he's described as a man who feared God and shunned evil. And just in case you think that this book might be describing some other pagan god that Job was worshipping, you need to realize that the book repeatedly refers to Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel. The book can be thought of as a sandwich. It starts and it ends with prose, that is ordinary, non-poetic language, and it's filled in the middle with poetry. So we have prose, chapters 1 to 2, poetry, chapters 3 to 42, verse 6, and then finally prose again, chapter 42, verses 7 to 17. An outline of the book of Job. The book divides into 5 parts. First of all, we have a prologue in chapters 1 to 2. Job is tested. These chapters explain what's going on behind the scenes of the story in God's heavenly courts. They confirm for the reader that Job is a blameless man. He's innocent. Sin is not the reason that God has brought this trouble upon him. Rather, his faith is being put to the test. Then we come to the second section, chapters 3 to 31, where we have the discussion between Job and his three friends. Three friends come along to try to comfort him. They suggest that Job's suffering is because of his sin. He's clearly done something wrong, maybe something hidden that has caused God to be angry with him, they suggest. It's as simple as cause and effect. There's no such thing as undeserved suffering. But Job insists that that isn't true. And in doing so, he questions the justice of God. And he asks for the right to question God. He shifts the blame that's been unfairly attributed to him to God himself. Which brings us to the third section, Job and Elihu, chapters 32 to 37. Then Elihu, a new character, joins the debate. He's younger than the rest and clearly thinks he knows better than his elders. He criticizes the three other comforters for their unhelpful contributions. He makes 4 speeches in this section in which he tries to explain Job's situation. Elihu's contribution to the debate is to agree that Job's suffering is because he sinned and to suggest that he should learn from his suffering rather than just banging on about his innocence. Which brings us to section 4, Yahweh and Job, chapters 38 to 42, verse 6. So finally, after a lot of words, including a lot of half-truths and bad advice from these various men, God speaks out of the storm. Here's the truth of the matter. And Job is silenced before God. He recognizes that no one has the right to question the actions of the Almighty Creator. He has no right to accuse God of injustice. In his pain, Job was speaking about God out of ignorance. He recognizes that God's ways are greater than his ways. He recognizes that God is God and he is not. And he repents of his wrong words. Which brings us to the final section, the epilogue, where Job is vindicated. Chapter 42, verses 7 to 17. The story ends with God declaring that these comforters have misrepresented him. Even Job has gone too far in his questioning of God's character. But in comparison, God says that they hadn't spoken the truth about him as his servant Job had done. Job is then restored by God to his former position in life, and he lives a long life. Which brings us finally to the importance of the book of Job for Christians. First, this book warns us against easy answers to the problem of suffering in the world. We might conclude that God only blesses the righteous and curses the wicked. Like Job's comforters, we might suggest that personal suffering is always related to personal sin. But it's not as simple as that, the Bible tells us. This book shows us that the righteous do suffer sometimes. We can't simply blame people for their own suffering. And neither should we blame God. This book shows us that the suffering of the righteous is not because God is unjust. It teaches us that God's sovereign purposes are beyond human wisdom and understand it. The book poses the question, who is wise? Who's able to understand Job's suffering? You see, finally, it's only God who totally understands. And he doesn't need to explain his ways to those he's made. The book calls us to trust God in the middle of suffering, even when we don't understand it. The book reminds us that God is in control, even of Satan and of evil. We mustn't be scared of the forces of evil that are loose in our world, because this book reminds us that God reigns over all. And the New Testament tells us that God is at work in our lives in a similar way to Job. He's testing us and refining us as Christians, even through pain and difficulty, so that our faith might be proved genuine. The New Testament tells us that those who follow Jesus should expect suffering in this broken world. But God won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. And the day is coming, the New Testament tells us, when God will wipe every tear away from our eyes. And finally, we need to remember that God is not a disinterested and uncaring observer of our suffering. God himself has experienced the pain and the suffering of this broken world. You see, Jesus is the ultimate Job. He's the ultimate innocent sufferer. The one who wasn't simply blameless like Job, but is without any sin. The one who paid the price for our sin. The righteous one who suffered for us on the cross.